They kept him in a pit like an animal. They figured the stranger would die on his own by morning. But he managed to escape during the night, made his way to their campfire, and sat down next to the old woman who was cooking a thin broth, tossing hot stones into a leather bag. He watched her and had only one thought. There's a hammer in my head, and you're driving a nail in with a stone. The cold hit him first. Not the kind of cold you feel when you step outside without a jacket, but the kind that creeps into your bones and whispers, "You'll die in an hour if you don't find warmth." Daniel Kwan opens his eyes. Above him is a white sky and 4 figures. 3 men are aiming spears at his throat. The tips are flint. The shafts are ash. The bindings are made of tendons. Daniel's brain works faster than his fear. Late Paleolithic. Flake-flaking stoneworking technique. This isn't a dream or a prank. This is reality. The 4th figure is a woman holding a child. She looks at him as if he were a beast that might still bite. Daniel sits up. He raises his palms. It's -10, and a dry wind from the north cuts through his wet shirt. He'll be dead in an hour in these clothes. But he has no intention of dying, because 10 paces away, a fire is burning. A simple fire, made of branches on the bare ground. No hearth, no walls, no reflector. They don't even know you can keep a fire inside walls. And Daniel smiles with his cracked lips. He raises his palms higher and speaks in English that no one here understands. "All right, I'll teach you." A hunter hits him on the head with a spear shaft. The world goes white again. He woke up in the dark, in a pit knee-deep. Above him, more stars than he has ever seen. No satellite, no airplane, no light on the horizon, only stars and wind. His head is splitting. Blood has crusted over his forehead. His fingers won't bend. Daniel breathes into his fists. He slaps himself on the shoulders and thighs. He stands up and squats for 15 minutes until the blood starts flowing through his body again. The camp is burning 30 paces away. Voices. They didn't even tie him up. Decided he was too weak to be dangerous, or that he'd die on his own by morning. And this is where the strange part begins. He climbs out of the pit and walks toward the fire. No one is holding him back. 4 hunters raise their spears. Women press their children close. The old woman by the fire freezes over a leather pouch. Her face is all wrinkles. Her eyes are like flint. Around her neck is a necklace of bones and feathers. A shaman. Daniel sits down, not close, not far. He holds out his empty palms and watches what she's cooking. The old woman throws hot stones into the water. The stones hiss and crackle. Half the heat escapes into the air. The broth is as thin as water. And something inside Daniel tightens. Not pity, not superiority. That feeling when a child hammers a nail with a stone while you have a hammer in your pocket. He looks around. 48 people surround him. Men, women, children, old people. All thin, all hungry. Winter is in full swing. Food is running out. The hunters have returned empty-handed. You can see it on their faces, in the way they look at the children. Daniel sits by the fire until dawn. In the morning, he gets up and goes to the river. The bank is frozen solid, but in one spot, clay is exposed. Red, rich, good. He digs with his hands. His fingers burn, but he digs. He brings back a lump the size of 2 fists. He sits down and gets to work. He kneads the clay. He sprinkles in ash. He adds sand. He kneads until the mixture is smooth. And he shapes it. Not a pot. First, a bowl. Thick, rough, about 2 palms wide. He sets it to dry by the coals. The tribe watches. The children come closer. That very hunter who hit him on the head grimaces. The stranger has hurt his head. Daniel doesn't react. He waits. By evening, he pushes the bowl into the hot coals. He covers it with dirt. The tribe watches as the stranger buries the dirt in the fire. He doesn't sleep at night. He feeds the fire. He keeps the heat steady. The old woman sits across from him and doesn't sleep either. She stares without blinking. In the morning, Daniel rakes through the coals. He pulls out the bowl, black and red, hot. He taps it with his finger and it rings out, a clear, new sound. They've never heard anything like it here. He cools the bowl. He pours water from the river. The water doesn't run off. He throws in a bone from yesterday's cooking. He sets the bowl right on the coals and waits. The water boils. For real. Not from stones in a bag, from the direct heat below. The broth thickens, darkens. It gets richer. The smell wafts through the camp. The children come one after another. A girl is the first to approach. She's about 16, quiet, slender fingers. She isn't looking at the broth. She's looking at the bowl, at how the fire licks the bottom while the water inside boils. She looks as if she wants to understand not what he did, but how. Daniel hands her the broth. The girl drinks and cries, quietly, without a sound. Tears drip into the bowl. She has never eaten anything so hot, thick, and filling in her life. Daniel doesn't know their language, so he just sits there and watches her cry over the clay bowl. Then the shaman approaches. He takes the bowl. He drinks. He stares at the broth for a long time, at Daniel, at the bowl. He sets it on the ground. He straightens up. He spits into the snow and says one word. He'll understand it in 2 weeks when he learns their language. A simple word. Teacher. From that day on, they pull him out of the pit. They give him a place by the communal fire, a hide, a bone with bits of meat still on it. It's not much, but it means they've accepted him, not as one of their own, like a strangely shaped stone that hasn't been thrown away yet. It might suddenly come in handy. Daniel gnaws on the frozen meat and looks at the stars. He already has a list in his head. He needs more dishes, pots, bowls, kettles. He needs a hearth with a chimney so they can breathe in the dugouts. He needs to find copper. From the color of the stones on the shore, it's clear that further downstream there's an outcrop. Native copper might lie right on the surface. He needs to learn their language, quickly. You can't teach what people can't name. And he needs that girl, not for himself, for the future, because she was the only one who looked not at the broth, but at the bowl, at the process. And that means she is capable of understanding. Daniel closes his eyes. The wind howls over the camp. A nocturnal beast screams in the darkness. 48 people are sleeping all around, unaware that among them now lives a man who remembers how to smelt steel. He himself doesn't know much yet. He doesn't know that in 2 years he will speak a word to God's face that no one here has ever uttered before. No. He doesn't know that in 7 years he will howl at the sky above the bodies of his 130 men. He doesn't know that in 10 years he will lead 3,000 warriors in steel chainmail up the mountain to kill those whom the whole world considers immortal. Right now he knows one thing. Tomorrow he will make another pot, and the day after tomorrow another, and so on every day, until everyone in this tribe has a bowl from which to eat hot broth. Because it all starts with that, with hot food in sturdy bowls, with a simple thing made just right. Daniel Kwan falls asleep by a stranger's fire at the edge of the world, and he dreams of nothing. In the early days, Daniel counted the days by notches on a stick. 1 notch was 1 dawn. 5 notches, and he understood the main thing. He wouldn't be able to change anything until he spoke up. The tribe's language was rough and short. The words sounded like stone striking stone. No soft sounds, no long phrases. One word meant one thing. Stone, fire, meat, water, snow, death. Daniel began to learn it the way children learn. He pointed at an object and waited. Someone from the tribe would say the word. Daniel would repeat it, over and over, 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, until the language was memorized. The children laughed at his pronunciation. That was good. Laughter meant they weren't afraid of him. After 10 days, he knew 100 words. After 20 days, 200. That was enough to say simple things. I do, you look. Fire is hot. Clay is hard. Good, bad. More, yet. Over those 20 days, he fashioned 14 bowls. 3 of them cracked during firing. He raised the temperature too quickly. or the clay was too wet, or there wasn't enough sand. Each time, he remembered the mistake. 11 bowls survived, 11 ringing vessels in which food could be cooked and stored. For a tribe that had previously cooked only in leather pouches with hot stones, it was like a miracle. But Daniel knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the first step of 1,000. On the 12th day, a girl approached him, that very one, Sora. She sat down beside him in silence. She watched as he kneaded the clay. An hour later, she held out her hands. Daniel gave her a lump. She began to mimic his movements. Her fingers were slender and precise. She didn't press too hard. She didn't rush. She felt the material. Daniel showed her how to add ash, how to check for consistency, how to tell when the clay was ready by how it stuck to her fingers. Sora didn't ask questions. She just did it. By evening, she had shaped her first bowl. It was crooked, thick on one side and thin on the other, but it was whole. Daniel gave her a thumbs up. She didn't understand the gesture. He spoke the first compound sentence he'd learned in her language over the past few days. Good job. Sora looked at him as if he'd hit her. Then she quickly turned away and left. Daniel didn't understand. He would understand later, in a month when he had learned enough words to eavesdrop on other people's conversations. Sora was the youngest daughter of an old hunter. Her mother had died in childbirth. She had grown up quiet and unremarkable. No one in the tribe had ever told her she had done anything right. On the 15th day, Daniel began building a hearth. The dugout where the tribe lived was long and low, dug into the side of a hill. The roof was made of poles and animal skins. Inside, a fire burned right on the ground. Smoke filled the entire space. People coughed all winter long. The children had been breathing this smoke since birth. Daniel watched this and calculated in his head how many years of life this smoke was taking from each of them. He started with something simple. He molded a pipe out of clay, a long one, 2 cubits long, with a flared end. He fired it in the fire for 3 days because the pipe was thicker than a bowl and took longer to dry. Then he built a simple hearth against the wall of the dugout. Stones for the walls, clay as mortar between them. He ran the pipe through the roof to the outside. He sealed the joints with wet clay mixed with grass. He worked for 4 days. Chulsu stood nearby and watched. Chulsu was the tribe's senior hunter, big, broad-shouldered, with a scar across his entire left cheek. For 40 years, he had been the one everyone looked to, the one who decided where to go hunting, the one to whom the best cut was given. Now the young men were increasingly glancing at the stranger who was molding things out of mud. Chulsu said nothing, but Daniel saw his eyes. When Daniel lit a fire in the new hearth, smoke rose up the chimney. For the first time in the history of this dugout, the air inside was clean. People stood and breathed. They simply breathed deeply. One of the women laughed. The child who had been coughing every night since Daniel first arrived slept quietly that night. Hwasun approached the hearth. She placed her palm on the warm stones. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned to the whole tribe and said loudly, "Teacher!" It was no longer a nickname. It was a name. From that day on, that was what they called him, Teacher. The month was drawing to a close. Winter held the land in its grip. The hunters went out every day and returned after 2 or 3 days with a small catch. A couple of rabbits, sometimes a bird, once a young deer. It wasn't enough. Daniel watched the tribe eat. The men got their share first, then the women, the children last. The elders hardly ate. Hwasun gave her share to her grandchildren. He saw her chewing bark when she thought no one was watching. Daniel began to think about traps. He knew the principle. A loop made of sinew, a bent branch like a spring. Bait. He is not a hunter. He had never set a trap for an animal in his life. But he was an engineer. He understood mechanics, a lever, tension, a trigger mechanism. He made his first snare from what he found. A flexible branch from a young ash tree. A strip of sinew he gestured to one of the women to give him. A peg, a loop. He set it by the animal trail one of the young hunters had shown him. The boy's name was Jinu. He was Chul-Su's younger brother, a quiet sort, broad-shouldered but not as massive as his brother. He was the first of the men to approach Daniel, not with a spear, but with curiosity. In the morning, there was a rabbit in the trap, small, skinny, but alive and caught. Jinu stared at the trap for a long time, then at Daniel. Then he said one word: more. By the end of the first month, they had 12 traps set. Jinu checked them every morning, 3 or 4 rabbits a day, sometimes a marten, once a fox. The meat was meager, but it was steady. For the first time that winter, the tribe didn't go to bed on an empty stomach every third night. Daniel noticed one more thing. The women sewed clothes with bone needles, thick ones, rough. The needle would break after 10 days of work. The stitch was wide and weak. The wind blew through the clothes like through a sieve. He watched this and thought of copper. Somewhere further up the river, there must be a source of native copper. He had seen a greenish patina on the rocks near the shore. Malachite, a sure sign. But he couldn't get there until spring. The river was frozen, snow up to his waist. He could only wait. In the meantime, while he waited, he did what he could. He made pottery, he taught Sora, he repaired what was broken. On the 20th day, he noticed that Sora's left arm was moving strangely. Her wrist wouldn't straighten all the way. He asked using gestures and 3 words. She showed him. She'd fallen as a child. The bone had healed wrong. It had been a long time ago. Everyone had gotten used to it. She herself had gotten used to it. Daniel examined her arm. The fracture had healed with a misalignment. Ideally, it would have to be broken again and set correctly, but he had neither tools, nor anesthesia, nor antibiotics. He did something else. He stripped the bark from a tree. He carved a splint to fit her forearm. He soaked it in hot water and wrapped it tightly around her arm. Very tightly. He told her in the 3 words he knew. Don't work. 3 hands of the moon. He held up 3 fingers and pointed at the moon. 3 weeks. Sora looked at him as if he were crazy. Not to work for 3 weeks in the middle of winter when every pair of hands counts. But she listened. 3 weeks later, when he removed the bark bandage, her arm wasn't perfect, but it moved more freely. Her wrist extended further. Sora bent and straightened her fingers. Then she looked at Daniel, and she said in her language the words he by then already understood. You see what others don't see. Daniel wanted to reply that he simply knew first-year anatomy, but he didn't know how to say that in a language that lacked a word for bone in the medical sense, so he just nodded. Winter continued. The snow didn't melt. The wind didn't die down. But inside the dugout, it was warm from the hearth and clean from the chimney. Broth simmered in pots. Every morning there was a catch in the traps. The children didn't cough at night, and one stranger sat by the fire every evening and scratched drawings on a flat stone with a stick charred in the coals. Drawings that no one understood. Schematics, blueprints, plans. The staircase he was building in his mind, step by step, from the bottom up, into the sky. During the first month, Daniel learned the words of the tribe's language and fashioned 11 ceramic vessels. He built the first hearth with a chimney and taught Zin how to set snare traps. Sora became his first apprentice in pottery. Chul-Su began to lose influence among the young hunters. Spring came like a blow. One day, the wind shifted. From north to south, snow began to settle. Streams flowed from beneath the snowdrifts in thin threads. The river swelled and roared, and Daniel realized his time had come. He had waited 3 months for this. For 3 months, he had gazed at the greenish stones by the shore and counted the days. Now the ice had melted. The trails were open. He could go upriver, but he could not go alone. Daniel went to Chul-Su. The elder hunter was sitting at the entrance to the dugout, sharpening a flint spearhead. He did this every morning, with precise strokes, chip by chip, 40 years of practice in every movement. Daniel sat down beside him and spoke. In 3 months, his language had become good enough for simple conversations. He said he needed to go upriver. A day's journey, maybe 2. He needed a hunter for protection. Chul-Su didn't turn his head. He asked why. Daniel said he was looking for a special stone, red and green, a stone that could be made soft over a fire. Chulsu stopped working. He looked at Daniel. Soft stone. Those two words didn't go together in his language. A stone is a stone. It's hard. Always. Daniel didn't argue. He simply said, "You'll see." Chulsu was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He took his spear, and he went to the river. Daniel followed. Zin caught up with them after 100 paces. No one had called him. He just went. They walked upstream all day. The banks were muddy and slippery from the melting snow. Daniel looked at the rocks, at the color of the rock, at the veins and the outcrops. He was looking for green, malachite. Where there is malachite, there is copper. By evening, they found it. A rock outcrop at a bend in the river, gray stone with bright green veins, and in one spot, right on the surface, a dull reddish chunk. Daniel picked it up, heavy, solid. He scraped it with his fingernail. Beneath the oxidation, a reddish glow shone through. Native copper, pure, unadulterated, a chunk the size of fist. Daniel stood there, holding it in his hands, and felt his heart pounding in his throat. There it was, the staircase, the next step. Chulsu looked at the stone expressionlessly. Beautiful. But why? Daniel said he would show him. They gathered as many nuggets as they could find that evening, 6 pieces, the largest about the size of 2 fists, the smallest the size of a thumbnail. They carried them back in a leather bag for 2 days because Daniel stopped at every rock outcrop and examined the rock. He memorized it. Here a green vein runs deep. Here is red clay with a high iron content. Here is quartz sand that will be useful for crucibles. His brain worked like a database. Every stone, every mineral, every color told him something. When they returned to camp, Daniel immediately got to work. He took the smallest piece of copper, placed it on a flat stone, and began striking it with another stone. Cold forging, the oldest method of metalworking on Earth. No fire, no smelting, just blow after blow. The copper it yields. The nugget flattened out. Daniel bent the edges. He struck it again and again. After 4 hours of work, he held an awl in his hands. Rough, crooked, but sharp. And stronger than bone. He walked over to the hide, drawing on a frame by the dugout. He poked it with the awl. The awl went through the hide as if through water. Clean, effortless. The hole was even, round. With a bone awl, it would take a minute of pressure and rocking to make such a hole. With a copper one, just a moment. People were already standing around. Chulsu held out his hand. Daniel handed him the awl. The senior hunter twirled it between his fingers. He tested the tip with the pad of his thumb. He pricked the hide himself. He looked at the hole, then at Daniel. There was something new in his eyes. Not irritation, not jealousy. Fear. Chulsu understood it before the others did. If this red-green stone could be made into an awl that cut through the hide like butter, then it could be made into a knife. And if a knife, then a spearhead. And if a spearhead, then the world in which he was the best hunter had just changed forever. Daniel saw that fear, and he made a decision that he would later consider one of the most important of his life. He walked over to Chul's, took the awl, and, in full view of the entire tribe, picked up a second piece of copper, larger than the first, placed it on the stone, and began to forge. 4 hours, 6 hours. He worked until dark, and then, by the light of the fire. His hands ached, his fingers were rubbed raw and bleeding, but by dawn he had a knife. Rough, thick, without a handle, just a strip of copper sharpened on one edge and bent on the other so it could be held. He walked over to Chul's, who was sitting at the entrance to the dugout, waiting for dawn to go hunting. He held out the knife, handle first, and said 3 words, "To the tribe's best hunter." Chulsu took the knife. He ran his finger along the blade. The copper wasn't truly sharp yet. It couldn't be compared to a good flint knife in terms of cutting ability. but it didn't break. Flint cracks and crumbles. Copper bends. Copper can be straightened out. Copper was eternal by the standards of a man who had spent his whole life replacing stone knives every 2 months. Chulsu was silent for a long time. Then he nodded, once, briefly, and he went hunting with the copper knife on his belt next to the flint one. Daniel exhaled. The war with Chulsu was postponed. Not cancelled, postponed. Spring was gaining strength. The snow was melting. The ground was thawing. And Daniel began the next stage, bellows. To truly smelt copper, not just forge nuggets, he needed heat. 800 degrees minimum. An open fire gives 300, maybe 400 if he's lucky with the firewood. He needed a bellows. He needed air forced into the fire. He needed bellows. He knew how to make them. 2 pieces of tanned hide sewn together with wooden handles and a valve. Air enters through the valve when released and exits through the nozzle when compressed. Simple. But he needed well-tanned hide. Soft, lightweight, elastic, tear-resistant. What the tribe was using now wouldn't do. Their hides were stiff, rough, poorly processed. Daniel knew another tanning method: ash and brains. The hide is soaked in a solution of ash to remove fat and hair. Then animal brains are rubbed into it. The fat from the brains soaks into the fibers and makes the skin soft. Then it's stretched and dried. Then it's smoked over a fire. The result is 10 times softer and more elastic than what the tribe had been producing. He showed this to the women. The process was long and smelly. 3 days of soaking in ash, a day of rubbing in the brains, 2 days of stretching and drying. 1 day of smoking. But when the first hide was ready and Daniel gave it to Hwasun, the old shaman stroked it for 5 minutes without taking her fingers off it. Then she looked at him and said quietly, "For 60 winters I have tanned hides. For 60 winters I have made them as my mother and my mother's mother did, and not a single of them was like this." Daniel nodded. He wanted to say that it wasn't magic, that it was chemistry, that the alkali in the ash dissolves proteins and the brain fat replaces them, making the collagen fibers elastic. But in this language, there was no word for chemistry. There was no word for protein. There was no word for collagen. So he simply said, "The ash eats the dirt in the skin. The brain feeds the skin with new softness. It works because that's how the world works." Hwasun looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You're not a shaman. A shaman speaks with spirits. You speak with things, and things listen to you." It was the most accurate description of engineering Daniel had ever heard in his life. Daniel found native copper upstream and forged the first copper awl and the first copper knife by cold hammering. He gave the knife to Chulsu, thereby preventing an open conflict over influence within the tribe. He taught the women a new method of tanning hides with ash and brain for the making of future furs. The summer was short and fierce. The sun rose early and set late. The earth steamed after the rains. The river had run dry, and one could walk along its bed without getting one's knees wet. Daniel went to the copper vein 4 times in 2 months. Each time, Xenu went with him. Each time, they brought back more. By midsummer, Daniel had 23 nuggets of native copper, enough for the next step. He was building a furnace. Not a real one. A real furnace required fired bricks, a clay nozzle, and a blower system. A pit would do for a start. He dug a pit a cubit deep. He lined the walls with stones. He sealed the cracks with clay. On one side, he dug a clay tube into the ground at an angle. That was the nozzle. At the other end of the tube, he attached bellows he'd spent 2 weeks sewing from new, soft leather. 2 pieces of leather, wooden slats, a bone valve, tendon strings. The construction was rough. Air leaked through the seams, but it worked. When Xenu pressed the bellows for the first time, a jet of air struck the coals and they flared orange. The heat rose so high that standing closer than 3 paces away was painful. This was the moment. Daniel placed a piece of native copper into the clay crucible. He had molded the crucible specifically for this purpose, thick-walled, made of clay mixed with quartz sand for heat resistance. He had fired it for 3 days. The crucible was placed in the furnace. Jinu pumped the bellows, steadily, vigorously. Daniel watched the color of the coals and the metal. Red, dark red, orange, light orange, yellow. Copper began to flow over the edges. The surface became glossy. Then it began to flow. Daniel watched it and held his breath. Liquid copper, red, shining, alive. He had seen this 1,000 times in his workshop in Pittsburgh. But here, in a world where people didn't even know what a potter's wheel was, it was like witnessing the birth of a star. He had prepared the mold in advance, a knife-shaped indentation in the wet sand. Roughly shaped, but sufficient. He took the crucible with bone tongs wrapped in wet leather. He tilted it. The copper flowed into the mold. An orange stream in the dark sand, a hissing sound, steam, the smell of hot metal. The whole tribe stood around, all 48 of them, children on their fathers' shoulders, women behind the men, Kvasun in front of everyone, leaning on a stick. No one said a word. They watched as stone became water, and water became a shape. When the copper had cooled, Daniel removed the blank from the sand. He tapped the edges, placed it on a flat stone, began to hammer. Now the metal was hot and malleable. Not like cold forging of nuggets, the hot copper yielded to the hammer like butter. He flattened the piece, stretched out the blade, bent the tang, sharpened the edge on a wet stone. 3 hours later, he held a knife in his hands. Not that rough piece of copper he'd given Chules in the spring, a real knife, with a smooth blade, with a sharp edge, with a tang onto which a handle could be fitted. He held it out to Chulsu. The senior hunter took it. He tested the blade. He ran it along the hide hanging on the frame nearby. The knife sliced through the hide with a soft rustle. Chulsu looked at the cut, smooth, clean. His best flint knife cut through the hide with a sawing motion, leaving a ragged edge. This one cut like a breath. Chulsu held the knife up to the light. The copper glowed with a red fire in the rays of the setting sun. He said one word, "How?" Daniel replied, "Fire and air and stone and hands, nothing more." Over the next 4 weeks, Daniel cast 12 knives, 6 spearheads, 4 awls, and 8 fishing hooks that Jinu had devised himself after looking at the bone hooks and asking if he could have the same thing, but made of ringing stone. Daniel laughed then. It was the first time he had laughed in this world, because Jin had just made the first engineering inquiry in the history of this tribe on his own. Could the same thing be made, but better, from a new material? That was the beginning. The tribe was changing. The copper knives cut faster. The copper spearheads penetrated deeper. The copper hooks didn't break in the water. The hunt became more successful. The fish came easily. There was more food. For the first time that summer, the tribe was preserving meat for the future. They dried it. They smoked it. They stored it in new, large pots that Sora now made almost as well as Daniel. Daniel taught her how to make pots with lids, pots for storing grain, if they ever found any, pots for water, pots for fat, each pot for its own purpose. Sora worked silently and with concentration. Her hands remembered everything the first time. She no longer asked how. She watched once and repeated it. Daniel told her she was more talented than he was. She didn't believe him. She had grown up in a world where a woman couldn't be more talented than a man at manual labor. But her pots were thinner than his, smoother, more beautiful. Once she decorated the rim of a bowl with a pattern of seashell imprints. Daniel saw it and stopped. It was the first decorative pottery in the history of this world. Sora had made it simply because she wanted the bowl to be not only useful, but also beautiful. He told her so. She didn't understand why he looked at the simple pattern on the rim of the bowl that way. To her, it was natural. To him, it was the beginning of art. By the end of summer, the news had spread. Neighboring tribes began to arrive. First, scouts. One or two people who came, supposedly by chance, and left a day later with their eyes wide open. Then the traders. They brought hides, dried meat, mammoth bone, salt, and they wanted one thing: ringing stones. That's what they called copper. Daniel didn't refuse. He traded copper knives for hides, copper needles for dried meat, copper hooks for bone and tendons. For the first time in its history, the Black River tribe became a center of trade. People came to it. They bought from it. They were afraid to offend it, because offending a tribe that possessed ringing stones meant depriving oneself of access to things one could no longer do without. Anyone who had once cut meat with a copper knife would never voluntarily return to flint. Daniel understood this, and it was both his weapon and his fear. Because news of the ringing stones did not reach only the neighboring tribes. It went further, higher, into the mountains, to where those whom everyone called the High Ones lived. Autumn came quickly. The leaves turned yellow overnight. The cold returned, and the birds streamed south in long black lines. Daniel counted the notches on his stick. 312. He had lived in this world for almost a year. Over the course of that year, the Black River tribe had changed so much that anyone who had seen it last winter would not have recognized it. 26 ceramic vessels, 3 hearths with chimneys in 3 dugouts, 42 traps on animal trails, copper knives for every adult, copper needles for every woman, food supplies for 3 months ahead. Daniel stood by the river and looked at the water. He was thinking about his next move. The bellows were working, but they weren't powerful enough. The horn provided enough heat for the copper, but copper is a soft metal. A copper knife bends when it strikes bone. A copper tip crumples when it hits thick hide. He needed bronze. Copper plus tin. An alloy 4 times harder than copper. An alloy that holds its edge. An alloy from which he could cast an axe capable of felling a tree in 10 strikes instead of 100. But there was no tin. Not here. Not in these rocks. Tin is a rare metal. Its deposits are far apart. Daniel knew this from his dissertation. Ancient civilizations built trade routes thousands of kilometers long just for tin. He had to search. Or wait until the traders brought news. He waited. And while he waited, he worked on what he could. He began making bows. Not those short sticks with strings that the tribe's hunters used. Real bows. Long ones. Made of yew, with the right cross-section. A flat belly, a rounded back, a bowstring made of twisted tendons. He wasn't an archer, he was an engineer, but he knew the physics of the bow better than any archer in this world. The length of the limbs determines the draw weight, the cross-section determines the elasticity, the bowstring determines the return speed. The material determines everything. Yew is ideal because its sapwood stretches while the heartwood contracts. 2 materials in one tree, a natural composite. He cut down a young yew tree by the river. He split the trunk lengthwise. He planed it with a copper knife. He dried it for 2 weeks by the fire, turning it every day. When the blank was ready, he shaped it. Long, 1.5 meters, with a thickening in the middle for the grip. He strung the bowstring. He tested it. The bow bent smoothly, springy, without a creak, without warping. The first arrow with a copper tip pierced the leather target from 30 paces right through. Chulsu came to watch. He asked to try it. He drew it back. He shot. The arrow flew twice as far as from his old bow. Chulsu stood and watched the spot where it had flown. Then he turned to Daniel. And for the first time in a year, he smiled. It was the smile of a hunter who realized his hunt had just gotten better. Not the smile of a friend. But Daniel accepted that too. In 3 weeks, he made 6 bows, 1 for each hunter. Every bow was different. Not because Daniel couldn't make them all the same, but because every hunter was different. For Chulsu, the bow was longer and heavier, suited to his broad shoulders and long arms. For Jin, it was shorter and faster, because Jin shot often and offhand. For the young Tae-ho, it was even shorter, because Tae-ho was a 15-year-old boy and his shoulders were still growing. Each hunter received a bow, and each noticed that the bow fit in his hand as if it had been made just for him, because that was exactly the case. One evening in late autumn, as Daniel sat by the fire whittling a blank for a new bow, Hwasun sat down beside him. The old shaman sat silently beside him for several minutes. Then she spoke. She said the call would come soon. Daniel didn't know that word. Hwasun explained. Once every 3 years, the High Ones send their messengers to every tribe. The messengers name a number. So many children, so many girls, so many hides. The tribe gives them up. If they do not, then, after a moon has passed, only a black circle of scorched earth remains at the campsite. Daniel listened and felt something harden inside him. He asked when the last call had been. Hwasun said it was 2 winters ago, before he arrived. That time they gave up 2 boys and 3 girls. One of the girls was 13. Daniel asked what happened to them. Hwasun said no one knows. They go with the messenger into the mountains and never return. Daniel was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind whistled over the dugout. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog or a wolf howled. He thought of the 13-year-old girl who had gone into the mountains 2 years ago and never returned. He thought of Sora, who was now sleeping in the dugout, who was 16, and who was exactly the age the High Ones took. He thought that in a year the call would come, and one of these people whom he had taught and fed and for whom he had forged knives would have to stand up and go with the messenger into the mountains and never return. He asked Hwasun if it was possible to refuse. The old woman looked at him as if he had asked if it was possible to stop winter. She said that 3 generations ago, one tribe had refused. In the morning, there was a black circle where they had been. 56 people, not a single survivor. Daniel nodded. He said nothing more that evening. He lay down and didn't sleep until morning. And in the morning, he went to the forge and began to work. Faster than before. More knives, more arrowheads, more arrows. He didn't explain why, but Jinu looked at his face and understood without words. Jinu began pumping the bellows without asking. Sora came and sat down to mold the casting forms. She didn't ask anything either. She just worked alongside him. 3 days later, a trader from the White Owl tribe came to the campfire. He brought news and hides for trade. The news was both good and bad. The good news was that 6 days' journey to the southeast there was a river with gray stones, heavy ones, with a special sheen. The trader didn't know what they were. Daniel knew. Cassiterite, tin ore. The bad news was that the river was on the territory of the Red Bull tribe, a large tribe, a warlike one. They didn't trade, they took. Daniel looked at Xena. Xena looked at Daniel. Then both looked west, toward where, beyond the horizon, rose the mountains inhabited by those whom everyone called gods. The year had ended. Winter had returned. Snow fell on the ground and on the roofs of the dugouts and on the new kiln that Daniel had covered with hides to protect it from the frost. Daniel carved the 312th notch on the stick, then the 13th on a new stick because the old one had run out. He sat by the hearth and, by the light of the fire, drew with a burnt stick on a piece of birch bark. A map. Rough. Approximate. A river, mountains to the west, the White Owl tribe to the north, the Red Bull tribe to the south, and between them a small dot at the bend in the river, the Black River, his people. 48 men. With copper knives and yew-bows and clay pots, against a world that wanted to leave them in the Stone Age forever. Sora came over and sat down beside him. She looked at the map. She already knew what those marks. She asked quietly what he was drawing. He said he was drawing the future. She was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Is the future good?" Daniel looked at her slender fingers stained with clay, at her left hand, which now moved more freely, at the eyes in which the reflected fire burned. He said, "I'll make it good." It was a promise, the first promise he had made in this world. and the hardest one. Because to keep it, he had to make it in time. Make the transition from copper to bronze, from bronze to iron, from iron to steel, and do all this before the high ones came for what they considered theirs, for the children, for the girls, for Sora. Daniel crafted yew-bows for all the hunters, selecting each bow for a specific person. Hwasun told him about the call of the High Ones, who every 3 years demand a tribute of children and girls. A merchant brought news of tin ore 6 days' journey away, but in hostile territory. Daniel began preparing for the coming confrontation, realizing that the call would come in a year. The second winter was different. Not easier, but different. The frosts struck earlier than last year, and the river froze over in a single night. But in the dugouts, fires burned in hearths with chimneys. Thick broth made from their supply of dried meat simmered in pots. The traps worked even in the snow, and every morning Xenu brought back 2 or 3 rabbits. The tribe did not go hungry. For the first time in many winters, the children did not cry at night from hunger. Daniel made use of the winter. He could not go to the copper vein, he couldn't search for tin, but he could do what didn't require trips out. He made arrows, hundreds of arrows, shafts from straight branches, feathers for the fletching, copper tips cast in molds that Sora had sculpted with such precision that every tip came out identical. Daniel had taught her how to make 2-part molds, 2 halves of fired clay that fit together. Copper is poured into the gap from above. When the mold cools, they open it and remove the finished tip, identical every time. Sora understood the principle from the first demonstration. A week later, she was making molds better than he was, more precisely, more neatly. Her fingers felt the clay the way his fingers felt the metal. They worked side by side every day. He was at the furnace, she was at the potter's wheel he had cobbled together from flat stones and wooden supports. They hardly spoke, not because they couldn't. Daniel already spoke the tribe's language fluently. It was simply that a silence had settled between them that required no words. The silence of people doing the same work and understanding each other by sound. By the way she tapped the clay with her tool, he knew the mold was ready. By the way he blew on the coals, she knew the smelting was beginning and it was time to carry the crucible. One night, when everyone was asleep, Daniel took out a piece of copper he had been hiding for 3 weeks. Small, flat. He worked on it every night for an hour, polished it with river sand, sanded it with wet leather. He shaped it into an oval. When he finished, he held a disc the size of his palm, smooth, shiny, one side slightly convex. The copper was polished to such a degree that you could see a reflection in it. Not clear, not like in a glass mirror, but clear enough to see a face, eyes, mouth, the shape of the cheekbones. He made a handle out of deer bone. He tied it on with a leather strap. In the morning, he gave it to Sora. She took it, turned it over in her hands, didn't understand. Daniel told her to look at the shiny side. Sora raised the disc to her face and froze. She stared into the copper mirror for a long time, a very long time. Daniel saw her eyes widen, her lips part slightly. Her fingers clenched the handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. She saw herself, for real. Not a blurry reflection in the water that shimmers and ripples in the wind, but her own face, clear, real. High cheekbones, dark eyes, a scar on her chin from a childhood fall. She was beautiful and didn't know it because no one had ever told her, and she had nothing to see it in. Daniel said quietly, "There you are. You're visible." Sora stood up silently. She walked silently into the dugout, and she cried until morning. Hwasun found Daniel by the stove an hour later. She sat down beside him. She said he had done a dangerous thing. He asked why. She said that showing a person their own face was like giving them a second name. After that, they were no longer who they had been. Daniel thought for a moment and said that was exactly what he wanted. Hwasun looked at him for a long time. Then she said that he was either the wisest person she had ever met or the most dangerous, and she left. Winter dragged on. Daniel worked. Arrows, arrowheads, knives. He forged every day. Jinu helped him. The boy turned out to be a natural blacksmith. His hands could sense the heat of the workpiece without touching it. He knew when the metal was ready for the blow by its color and by the way the air shimmered above it. Daniel taught him in silence. He showed him. Jinu repeated, more precise each time, more confident each time. Once, Jinu forged a spearhead that was better than Daniel's, smoother, more symmetrical. Daniel showed the spearhead to Chulsu. He said his younger brother had made it. Chulsu took the tip. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Jinu, who was standing to the side, waiting. Chulsu walked over to his brother and put a hand on his shoulder. He said nothing. But Jinu stood up straight, and from that day on, he walked differently, with his head held high. Spring came, and with it came what Daniel had both waited for and feared. On the third day after the river thawed, a man approached the camp. Alone. Tall. Very tall. A head taller than Chulsu, who was the tallest in the tribe. Skin as pale as milk. Eyes gray. Cold. Clothes made of a fabric they didn't know how to make in this world. White. Thin. Not fur, not leather, something else. Metal bracelets on his wrists. Silvery. Smooth. Daniel saw those bracelets and the world slowed down. His metallurgical engineer's brain processed it in a second. The surface was too smooth for forging. The color was too even for silver. The sheen was too cold for any metal that could be obtained in a furnace. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist in a world of stone knives and bone needles. Titanium, or stainless steel, or an alloy he couldn't identify at a glance, but definitely a product of technology thousands of years ahead of anything these people possessed. The messenger stopped in the center of the camp. The tribe gathered around. The people dropped to their knees. Everyone. Except Daniel. Except Hwasun, who stood leaning on a stick. And except Sora, who stood behind Daniel, clutching a copper knife in her hand. The messenger spoke. His voice was low and steady. He wasn't shouting. He didn't threaten. He simply spoke like a man who had never heard the word no in his life. He named a number. 3 children, 4 girls, 10 bundles of the finest hides. A tribute for 3 years. The deadline was 10 days. Then he turned and left, just as calmly as he had arrived, without looking back. The tribe stood in silence. Daniel could feel his heart pounding in his temples. 3 children, 4 girls. He looked at Sora. She was 17. She was exactly the kind they were taking. He looked at Hwasun. The old woman was looking at him. There was a question in her eyes. Not hope. A question. What will you do now, teacher? Daniel stood there for a long time. The women were crying all around him. The men were silent, their faces stony. The children clung to their mothers, not understanding what was happening, but sensing fear. Then he spoke, loudly, louder than he had ever spoken in this world. He said one word, no. The silence became absolute. Even the wind seemed to freeze. Chulsu turned to him. The elder hunter's face was gray. He said Daniel was mad, that the tall ones would wipe them out in a single night, that the black circle was no fairy tale, that his grandfather had seen such a circle with his own eyes. 56 people, not a single survivor. Daniel listened. Then he said, I know, but I won't give up the children. I won't give up the girls. I won't give anyone up. If they come, we'll meet them. Chulsu asked how. With what? Bone spears against the gods? Daniel said, not bone. And he went to the furnace. 10 days. He had 10 days. He worked without sleep, literally. For the first 3 days, he didn't lie down even once. Zin worked beside him. Sora molded the forms. Even Chulsu came on the second day and silently began hauling coal for the furnace. They cast 20 copper spearheads, long ones, narrow ones, with a stiffening rib down the middle that Daniel had devised so the copper wouldn't bend on impact. They made 20 new arrows with copper tips. They repaired all 6 yew bows and fitted them with new bowstrings. On the 5th day, Daniel began doing something he hadn't done before. He took the largest piece of copper he had, melted it, cast a long strip into a mold of wet sand, tapped it, stretched it, sharpened it. It wasn't a knife. It was longer than a knife, already, thinner, with a bone crossguard and a leather-wrapped hilt. It was a sword. The first sword. Copper. Soft. It would break after 10 strikes if struck against stone, but if struck against flesh, it would go in like butter. And it was longer than any knife in this world, longer than an arm. That gave them distance, and distance in battle is life. On the morning of the 10th day, they stood in formation at the camp entrance. 20 men and women with spears tipped with copper, 6 archers with yew bows and copper arrows, Daniel with a copper sword in his hand. Hwasun stood behind everyone. She could not fight, but she could stand, and she stood. The messenger arrived at exactly noon, alone, without an entourage. He walked across the field toward the camp with the same lazy confidence with which he had arrived 10 days ago, because no one had ever resisted him in his life. He was alone. For a single wild tribe, one was enough. He stopped 20 paces away. He looked at the spears, at the bows, at the formation, and Daniel saw it, a moment. As brief as a heartbeat. Confusion. The tall one hadn't expected this. No one had ever stood before him with weapons in hand. That moment lasted a second. Then the messenger's face turned to stone again. He stepped forward. Daniel shouted. The first row lowered their spears. 6 bows drew back. The tall one took another step. And Chulsu fired. The arrow struck the envoy in the left shoulder. It went in deep, all the way to the fletching. The tall one flinched. He stopped. He looked at the arrow, at his shoulder, at the blood. Red. Ordinary. Human. A second arrow struck his chest. The tall man took a step back, then another. He looked at the line of people before him, at the bronze spearheads, at the bows that were still drawn, at one man holding a long, shiny object in his hand. The messenger turned and walked away, with 2 arrows in his body. He didn't fall. He didn't scream. He just walked away, back across the field, toward the mountains. The tribe stood in silence. Then Chulsu lowered his bow. His hands were trembling. Everyone's hands were trembling. Hwasun approached Daniel. She took his hand. Her fingers were icy. She spoke softly. "You know what will happen now." Daniel knew. Now there would be war. Daniel had made a bronze mirror for Sora, and she saw her own face for the first time. A summons came from the High Ones, demanding a tribute of 3 children and 4 girls. Daniel refused and, within 10 days, armed the tribe with copper spears and bows. The High One's messenger left with 2 arrows in his body, and the tribe knew that war was coming. 3 days passed after the messenger left. Nothing happened. No punishers, no fire from the sky, no black circle, just silence. And the silence was the most terrifying of all. The tribe lived in anticipation. People spoke in whispers. Children did not stray from their mothers. Hunters slept with spears in their hands. Chulsu posted sentries on the trails leading to the camp. 2 men to the west, 2 in the north. He did this without Daniel's orders. He did it because he was a hunter and knew that a wounded beast returns. On the 4th day, Daniel gathered everyone around a large fire. He spoke at length, choosing his words carefully. He said that the messenger would go into the mountains. He would tell them what had happened. The High Ones would decide what to do. It would take time. Maybe a moon, maybe 2, but they would come, and they would not come alone. Therefore, the tribe must prepare, not for a single skirmish, for war. Chulsu asked how to fight the gods. Daniel said they were not gods. The messenger was bleeding out, red blood, human blood. The arrow pierced his shoulder just as it would the flesh of any beast. So they can be wounded, and what can be wounded can be killed. Those words hung in the air. The people exchanged glances. To them, it was as if someone had said that winter could be killed, or a river, or the sky. The tall ones were part of the world. They had always been. The thought that they could be killed did not fit in their minds. But the arrow in the messenger's shoulder fit, and the blood on the snow fit. Daniel gave the tribe a week to digest it. Then he got to work. The first thing he did was send Zin to the White Owl tribe. 2 young hunters went with him. They carried gifts, 6 copper knives, 4 copper arrowheads, and 2 of Sora's finest pots. The task was simple. Find out about tin. Where exactly that gray river the merchant spoke of was located. How far away. How many people it would take to get there. And whether it was possible to make a deal with the Red Bull tribe, or if they would have to bypass their territory. Zin left. Daniel began the second task. He was building a wall. Not a stone fortress. There was neither time nor manpower for that. A simple palisade. Sharpened logs dug into the ground around the perimeter of the camp. The work was hard. 10 men chopped down trees with copper axes. Women and children dragged the logs to the camp. Daniel marked out the line of the palisade with stakes and a rope. He used measurements for the first time. He stretched a rope between 2 stakes. He measured a distance the length of a step. He repeated it, a straight line, even, equal intervals. The people watched this with surprise. They had never built anything straight. Their dugouts were crooked. Their trails meandered. A straight line was something unnatural, almost magical. Daniel explained it to Chulsu. A straight wall is stronger than a crooked one, because the pressure is distributed evenly. Chulsu didn't understand the word pressure. Daniel demonstrated. He took 2 sticks, one straight, one crooked. He stood them upright. He pressed down on top. The straight one held. The curved one broke. Chulsu nodded. From that day on, he made sure every log in the palisade stood as straight as that stick. The palisade grew, slowly. The logs were heavy. The holes were dug with bone and copper shovels. The ground hadn't fully thawed yet. But within 3 weeks, a wall as tall as a man with pointed tops had risen around the camp. Not a fortress, but enough to slow them down, to give time to raise the bows, to turn the open camp into a place where they could defend themselves. Jinu returned in 12 days. The news was complicated. There was tin, indeed, 6 days of travel to the southeast. The River of Gray Stones, as it was called. On its banks lay chunks of heavy gray stone that no one used because they were unsuitable for either knives or arrowheads. But the territory belonged to the Red Bull tribe. 120 people, warlike, led by a chief named Guan, who was famous for having killed a cave bear single-handedly and wore its fangs around his neck. A deal could be made, but the price would be high. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. Then he made a decision. He would go himself, to the Red Bull, with gifts. With a proposal. Chulsu said it was madness, that Guhan would kill him and take the gifts. Daniel said that Guhan wouldn't kill a man who could do for him what no one else could. He took 5 copper knives with him, 3 spearheads, and one thing he had made especially for this, a copper pot, a large one, big enough for 10 servings of broth, with a handle, with a lid, cast. A fine piece of work, the best thing he had ever made in this world. The 4 of them set out, Daniel, Jinu, Chulsu, and Teho, a 16-year-old archer boy who was the fastest runner in the tribe. If anything went wrong, Teho was to run back and warn them. A 6-day journey through the forest and the tundra. Daniel walked, looking around. Every rock, every outcrop. He memorized everything. Here is clay with a high kaolin content. It'll come in handy for heat-resistant crucibles. Here's a limestone outcrop, flux for future iron smelting. His brain never shut off. On the 7th day, they reached Red Bull's camp, a large encampment, 6 dugouts, many people, many spears. Guhuan received them by the fire, a huge man, 1.5 times wider than Chulsu, scars all over his face and chest, a necklace of bear fangs around his thick neck. He looked at Daniel as if he were an insect, small, skinny, without scars, without a spear, holding some kind of shiny pot in his hands. Daniel placed the gifts before Guan, knives, spearheads, a pot. Guan took a knife. He tested the blade. His eyes changed. He cut the hide lying nearby with the knife and looked at the cut, then at Daniel, then back at the knife. Daniel spoke. He said he needed gray stone from the river, lots of gray stone. He said that in exchange, he would give the Red Bull knives and arrowheads, every moon, as many as needed. Guan listened. Then he asked, why gray stone? It's useless. Daniel said that by combining gray stone and ringing stone, one could make a metal harder than either of them. Guan didn't believe him. Daniel said he would show him. If Guan gave him the stone and 2 days. Guan thought for a long time. Then he nodded. He was curious, and he liked the knives. Jinu and Teho went to the river and in half a day brought back 4 pieces of cassiterite, heavy, gray, with a dull sheen. Daniel asked permission to build a furnace. Guan gave his permission. Daniel and Jinu worked for 2 days. They built a furnace out of stones. They lit it. Daniel crushed the cassiterite into powder with a stone. He mixed it with charcoal. He poured it into a crucible. He placed it in the furnace. Jinu pumped the bellows. Reduction smelting. The carbon from the charcoal takes oxygen away from the tin oxide. Pure tin remains. The melting point is only 230 degrees. Child's play for a furnace that melts copper. 4 hours later, a pool of silvery metal lay at the bottom of the crucible. Tin. Pure. Soft. Daniel took it in his hands. Warm. Malleable. He rolled it between his fingers like dough. Then he took one of the copper tips he had brought as a gift. He melted it in the crucible. When the copper became liquid, he added tin. 10 parts copper to 1 part tin, the classic ratio. The metal in the crucible changed color. It became lighter, more golden. Daniel poured the alloy into a knife mold. He waited. He took it out. He tapped it. He sharpened it. The knife was different. The color was different. The sound was different. When Daniel tapped it with his fingernail, it rang out, clear, long. Copper doesn't ring like that. Bronze does. He gave the knife to Guhuan. The Red Bull chieftain took it. He tested the blade and cut himself, because bronze holds its edge 4 times better than copper. The blade was sharper than anything Guhuan had ever seen in his life. The chief looked at the blood on his finger, then at the knife, then at Daniel, and laughed. Loudly. Loud enough for the whole camp to hear. He said there was as much gray stone on the river as there was sand, and that Daniel could take as much as he wanted. If 5 such knives were brought to Red Bull every moon. Daniel nodded. They shook hands. The first trade agreement in the history of this world. Daniel built a palisade around the camp and sent Zin to scout the path to the tin ore. Then he went himself to the hostile Red Bull tribe and demonstrated to Chief Guhuan how to smelt bronze from copper and tin. He concluded the first trade agreement to exchange bronze knives for access to cassiterite. Bronze changed everything. Not immediately, not in a day, but over the next year, the world around the Black River tribe became a different place. The first shipment of cassiterite arrived 2 weeks after the agreement with Guhuan. 20 pieces of gray stone. Jin and Teho carried them on their backs for 6 days. Daniel smelted non-stop. Bronze was easier to work with than copper. The alloy was malleable. It poured smoothly. It solidified without cracks. It held its shape. The first bronze knives were gone within a week. 5 to Guhuan, as per the agreement. 3 to the White Owl for information and mediation. The rest to his own people. Every hunter received a bronze knife, then a bronze spearhead, then a bronze axe. The axe was a breakthrough. A copper axe took 50 blows to chop down a tree. A bronze one took 20. A flint one didn't chop at all. It pierced and shattered. The bronze one cut, cleanly, deeply. Trees fell faster. Dugouts were built faster. A palisade that would have taken all summer to build was erected in 2 weeks. The camp expanded. The first to arrive were families from the White Owl tribe, 14 people. They had heard about the resonant stones that don't break, about the walls around the camp, about the pots in which one can cook without stones. They came and asked permission to live nearby. Daniel couldn't decide this alone. He went to Chulsu and Hwasun. They decided together. Hwasun said to accept them. More people meant more hands to work and more hunters for protection. Chulsu said that outsiders might not listen to him. Daniel said they would listen to whoever gave them bronze spears. Chulsu looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. They were accepted. Then 12 more came from the Swift Otter. Then 8 loners, fugitives from tribes that had been destroyed, hunters who had lost their families, women with children without husbands. Daniel accepted them all. He gave everyone work. Those who knew how to hunt went to Chul's. Those who were skilled with their hands went to Jin. Those who knew nothing went to Sora to learn how to make pots. By the middle of the 3rd year, there were 110 people in the settlement. Daniel stopped calling it a camp. It was a village. The first real village in this world. With a stockade. With 3 kilns. With a pottery workshop. With a food storage area. With separate dugouts for families instead of a single communal pit for everyone. He began building a stone smelter. Not an earthen furnace, but a real structure. Walls of stone set with clay mortar. A roof of poles and turf. Inside, 2 furnaces. A large one for smelting bronze, a small one for experiments, an exhaust vent through a clay pipe. The floor was packed down and sprinkled with sand. Xenu supervised the construction. He already understood enough that Daniel could tell him what was needed and go off to do other things. Xenu did it, precisely, reliably, without mistakes. He didn't invent, he executed. But he executed flawlessly. Daniel knew the value of such a man. In any workshop in the world, a craftsman who does what is needed and how it is needed is worth more than 10 geniuses who do as they please. While the smelter was being built, Daniel thought about writing. The problem was simple. The alloy recipes were stored in his head, in Jinu's head, in Sora's head. If he died tomorrow from a stray arrow or an illness, everything he knew would die with him. The world would return to the Stone Age within a single generation. He needed a way to store knowledge outside his head. He started with something simple: pictograms, drawings. Each symbol represented a single concept. A circle meant a pot. A circle with a wavy line inside meant water. A triangle meant fire. A rectangle meant stone. A rectangle with dots meant ore. He drew the first 30 symbols on a flat stone with a burnt stick. He showed them to Sora. She understood within an hour. He showed them to Xin. He understood in 2 days. He showed the children. The children memorized them in half a day and began drawing symbols on every available surface. 2 weeks later, a little boy from the former White Owl tribe drew a pot symbol on the forehead of the sleeping Chulsu. The whole village laughed for half a day. Chulsu didn't laugh, but he wasn't angry either. That, too, was progress. Daniel wrote down the first recipe. Bronze, 10 pots of copper, 1 pot of tin. Heat until sunset colored. Pour into wet sand. Hammer while hot. Each step was a symbol. The sequence read from left to right. He carved it onto a flat stone and hung it on the wall in the smelter. Jinu could now smelt bronze according to the recipe, even without Daniel nearby. This was more important than it seemed. The 4th year got off to a rough start. Spring brought illness, a fever. 7 people fell ill. 2 children, 3 women, 1 old man, and Hwasun. Daniel wasn't a doctor. He was a metallurgist. But he knew about hygiene. He knew that dirty water kills, that wounds need to be washed, that the sick need to be kept separate from the healthy. He didn't know exactly what the illness was, but he knew how to reduce mortality from any illness. Clean water, rest, warmth, herbal decoctions that Hwasun knew better than anyone. The problem was that Hwasun herself was lying there in a fever, delirious. Daniel sat by her side for 3 nights. He gave her water. He changed the wet bandages on her forehead. In her delirium, Hwasun called out to people he didn't know, names from her youth, her mother, her sister, her husband, who had died 30 years ago. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Hwasun opened her eyes. She saw Daniel. She saw that he hadn't slept for 3 days, that his hands were trembling with exhaustion, that he was sitting beside her instead of at the forge. She said quietly, "You're a bad blacksmith. A good blacksmith doesn't abandon the forge." Daniel said that a good blacksmith knows which work cannot be put off. Hwasun closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in 4 years, he saw her smile. The old man had died. 1 child had died. 5 had recovered. Daniel stood by the small mound they had piled over the graves and thought about how he had no antibiotics, no vaccines, no surgical instruments. He could smelt bronze and forge a sword, but he couldn't save a child from a fever. Sora stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, and that was enough. After the illness, Daniel began building a water supply system, a simple one, a ditch from the stream to the village, lined with stones. Water flowed through the ditch and collected in a pit lined with fired clay. Clean, running water. Not from the river where horses drank and animals defecated upstream, but from a mountain stream. He couldn't explain bacteria to the tribe. He put it more simply. Evil spirits of disease live in stagnant water. In flowing water, the spirits cannot stay. Hwasun heard this and nodded. She added on her own that this was ancient wisdom they had forgotten, that her grandmother had said something similar. Daniel didn't argue. If superstition makes people drink clean water, then superstition is useful. By the end of the 4th year, there were 160 people in the settlement. 4 furnaces operated every day. Bronze tools were distributed to the surrounding tribes through traders. The Red Bull tribe became a permanent ally. Guwon came himself once every 2 moons, and each time sat by the furnace for hours, watching the smelting with the face of a child gazing at a miracle. Daniel gave him a bronze axe with a mammoth bone handle. Guwon wore it on his belt and never parted with it, not even in his sleep. The palisade had been expanded twice. A moat had been dug around the settlement. Not deep, knee-deep, but enough to slow down a running man, or a running god. The tall ones did not come. A 1.5 years of silence. Daniel did not believe in this silence. Every evening he stood on the wall and looked west, at the mountains. They were far away, blue, cold, silent. But somewhere out there sat those who considered themselves gods, and they were thinking about how to punish the tribe that had said no for the first time. Daniel returned to the furnace. Time was passing. He had to work faster. The village's population had grown to 160 people, thanks to the joining of neighboring tribes. Daniel built a stone smelter and created the first pictographic writing system to record recipes. The epidemic took 2 lives, but Hwasun survived. The tall ones hadn't appeared for 1.5 years, and Daniel used every day to prepare. In the 5th year, Daniel began searching for iron. Not because bronze was bad. Bronze was wonderful. But bronze required tin. The tin had to be hauled from a place 6 days' journey away. If the trade route were cut off, there would be no bronze. But iron was everywhere, in every swamp, in every river, in every patch of red earth. You just had to know how to get it. Swamp ore. A brown, crumbly rock that lay at the bottom of the swamps, a 2-hour walk from the village. People had walked past it for thousands of years without knowing that beneath that rusty crust lay a metal that would change the world. Daniel knew. Swamp ore is hydrated iron oxide, limonite. metal content ranging from 20 to 60%, enough for the smelting process. The problem was the temperature. Copper melts at 1080 degrees. Bronze is about the same. A bellows furnace could handle it, but iron melts at 1538 degrees. No furnace he'd ever built could handle that. And it wasn't necessary, because the smelting process doesn't melt iron, it reduces it. At high temperatures, carbon from charcoal strips oxygen from the ore. What remains is a spongy mass of iron and slag, pig iron. It isn't poured into a mold, it is forged, hammered until the slag is forced out, until the iron compacts, until the loose sponge turns into dense gray metal. This required a new furnace, bigger, taller, with a more powerful blast. Daniel built it over 2 months. Walls of fired brick, which he was making for the first time. Clay mixed with sand in wooden molds. Drying, firing. Every brick was identical, every one smooth. Sora made the molds. The children kneaded the clay with their feet. The women hauled sand from the river. The whole village worked. The furnace grew to human height, a shaft-type kiln. Ore and coal are loaded in layers from the top. Air is fed from below through 2 nozzles, 2 bellows. 2 men pump continuously. Slag flows out from the bottom through an opening. The slag remains inside. The first smelting failed. Daniel loaded the ore and coal. Jinu and Teho pumped the bellows for 4 hours. The temperature was insufficient. The ore clumped together but did not reduce. There was no iron. The slag looked wrong, too thick, too dark. Daniel took the furnace apart. He examined every brick. He found the problem. The nozzles were too wide. The air entered slowly and dispersed. He needed narrow nozzles, a fast flow, a directed blast of air into the center of the furnace. He remade the nozzles, molded them from clay with a high kaolin content, fired them twice, narrow, like 2 fingers. Second smelting, loading, blowing. Jinhu and Teho pumped the bellows. 1 hour, 2, 3. Daniel stood by the furnace and listened. The sound changed. The rumble grew higher, hotter, brighter. After 4 hours, he opened the bottom vent. Slag flowed out, liquid, light-colored. It was good slag. That meant the iron had separated. He waited for the furnace to cool. He took apart the top part and pulled out the bloom. A piece the size of 2 fists, gray, porous, heavy. Daniel took it in his hands. His hands were shaking. He carried the bloom to the anvil, a flat granite stone that had served as his anvil for 3 years. He placed the bloom down. He picked up the hammer, a stone one, heavy, and he began to strike. The bloom was hot. Sparks flew with every blow. Slag was squeezed out of the pores and dripped down. The iron compacted under the hammer. It became denser, harder, smoother. Daniel struck and struck. He turned it over. He folded it. He struck again. Forging. The most ancient and most honest work with metal. Hammer and anvil, hands and strength, and knowing where to strike and when. 2 hours later, he held a strip of metal in his hands, gray, dull, without the sheen of bronze, without the red of copper, dull and unremarkable. But when he picked it up and tried to bend it, it wouldn't bend. When he struck it against a stone, it didn't dent. When he ran it along a bronze knife, a scratch remained on the bronze. Iron. The first true iron in the history of this world. Daniel stood there, holding that strip in his hands, and he wept. Not out of joy, not out of pride, out of relief. Because for 5 years he had been building a ladder, step by step, clay, ceramics, copper, bronze, iron. Each step cost him months of work, sleepless nights, fingers rubbed raw, failures and reworks. And here he stands, holding in his hands the very thing that started it all. Metal that will change the rules. Because bronze is good, but iron is endless. Ore beneath his feet, coal from any tree, no need for trade routes 6 days' journey away, no need to depend on Guhuan and his gray river. Iron grants independence, and independence grants power. Jinu stood nearby. He looked at the strip of iron. He reached out his hand. Daniel gave it to him. Jin weighed it in his palm. He tapped it with his finger. He listened to the sound. And he said quietly, a different voice, not like a ringing stone, deeper, heavier. Daniel nodded. The iron sang differently. He spent the next 3 months at the furnace, smelting after smelting, crystal after crystal. He learned to feel this metal. The bog ore was dirty, lots of phosphorus, a lot of sulfur. The impurities made the iron brittle, fragile. 1 in 3 knives cracked during hardening. Daniel sorted through the ore by hand. He picked out the pieces with fewer impurities. He washed them, dried them. He roasted them before loading them into the furnace to remove moisture and some of the sulfur. The results improved, slowly, but better. By the end of the 5th year, he had enough iron blanks to make his first iron tools. Not weapons, tools. An iron axe, an iron chisel, iron tongs for the furnace, an iron hammer. He made the hammer first, heavy, solid, with an oak handle. When that hammer struck the anvil, the sound was different. Not the ringing of bronze, a dull, heavy thud, a blow that signaled the world had changed. By this time, the village's population had surpassed 200. 3 tribes had joined fully. 2 more sent people for trade. The trade network stretched 10 days' journey in every direction. Everyone knew the bronze knives of the Black River. But Daniel hadn't yet shown his iron to anyone outside the settlement. It was too early. Too early. The iron was still poor, brittle, unreliable. He needed steel, and for steel, he needed carbon. Daniel built a new type of blast furnace and, after 1 failed attempt, produced his first crude iron. The village's population had reached 200 people. The iron was still brittle due to impurities, so Daniel began working on purifying the ore and preparing for the next step, toward steel. The 6th year began with a discovery Daniel hadn't planned. He was sitting by the furnace at night, experimenting. The iron ingot lay in the coals. He kept it there longer than usual. Not because he wanted to, because he had dozed off. When he woke up, the ingot had been in the charcoal for 6 hours. He took it out. It looked different. The surface had darkened. It had become smoother. He struck it with a hammer. The sound was different. Not the dull thud of soft iron. A ringing, high-pitched, clear. Similar to bronze, but deeper. He ran the piece along a stone. A spark flew, bright and long. With pure iron, the spark is short and dull. With steel, it is long and bright. Carbon. 6 hours in charcoal at a high temperature. Carbon from the charcoal had seeped into the surface of the iron. Cementation, carbonization, the oldest method of making steel. He knew about it from his dissertation. The Hittites did this 3,000 years ago. The Japanese perfected it over centuries, and he had just done it by accident while dozing off by the furnace. Daniel laughed, quietly, in the dark, alone. Then he got to work. He took 10 iron billets. He placed them in a clay box. He covered them with charcoal, sealed the lid with clay, placed it in the furnace, and waited. 8 hours. Xenu pumped the bellows in shifts with Teho. When Daniel opened the box, the blanks were black, heavy, and when he struck the first one with a hammer, sparks flew like fireworks. He took 1 blank, heated it until it glowed yellow glow. He began to forge. The metal was different, springy, stiff. It resisted the hammer, but it obeyed, like a strong animal that had recognized its master. Daniel pulled the blank into a strip, long, narrow, with a double-edged grind, with a tang for the handle. It was a blade. He heated it until it glowed light red and plunged it into water, tempering. The water hissed. Steam hit his face. The blade rang out in the water with a high-pitched cry. Daniel pulled it out. The metal had become harder, but too hard, too brittle. He heated it again, but not until it was red, to straw red, just a little, and let it cool in the air, tempering, releasing internal stresses, a balance between hardness and toughness. He knew the exact tempering temperature for every grade of steel in his past world. Here, he went by color. Straw red meant 220 degrees, enough for a knife. For a sword, you need blue. 300, slightly softer, slightly more flexible. He picked up the finished blade, checked it, tapped it on the anvil. It didn't crack. Bent it. It springs back. It returns. Ran it along a piece of leather. It cut through without pressure. He ran it along a bronze knife. A deep groove remained in the bronze. The steel blade was unscratched. Daniel stood and looked at this blade, the first steel blade in the history of this world. 6 years. 6 years from a clay bowl to steel. In his past world, it took humanity 3,000 years to travel that path. 6 were enough for him, because he knew the way. He made a hilt from a deer antler. He wrapped it in leather. He bound it with a braided cord made of tendons. The blade sat tightly in the hilt, no wobble. A sword. The first steel sword. He brought it to the evening campfire. He laid it on the ground before Chulsu, Hwasun, Jinu, and Sora. He placed a bronze knife beside it. He told Chulsu to strike the bronze knife with the steel sword. Chulsu took the sword in his hands. He looked at it. He raised it. He struck the bronze knife lying on the stone. The bronze knife split in two, cleanly, like a dry branch. The steel blade remained undamaged. Silence. Chulsu raised the sword to the light. He turned it. The blade glinted in the firelight. Gray, cold, deadly. He ran his finger along the flat of the blade. Then he said, "This will kill the tall one." Daniel said, "Yes." Hwasun was silent. Sora was silent. Jinu looked at the sword with the eyes of a man who had seen the future and could not look away from it. Then Hwasun spoke. She said that the sword was good. But one sword isn't enough. We need many swords against the tall ones. Many people with swords, and time to train them. Daniel nodded. He knew that. One sword won't win a war. We need an army. And we need something else. Protection. Because the tall ones are stronger than humans. Faster, taller. A single blow from a tall one breaks a human's ribs. People need armor. Daniel began making chainmail. It was the longest and hardest work of his life. Steel wire. He pulled it through a hole in a stone slab, over and over. Stretched it to the right thickness. Cut it into rings. Bent each ring with pliers. Closed it. Threaded it through 4 adjacent ones. Closed the next one. Ring after ring. Row after row. 4 in 1. Classic weaving. He used to do this in his garage in Pittsburgh for reenactment festivals. There he had machines, vices, steel wire from the store. Here he had his hands. And time. Lots of time. He worked on the chainmail every evening for 2 hours, sometimes 3, ring after ring, monotonously, endlessly. Sora sat nearby and watched. On the 3rd evening, she asked if she could try. Daniel gave her some wire and pliers. An hour later, she was making the rings faster than he was. Her slender fingers turned out to be perfect for the job. She wove for 4 hours without stopping. By morning, she had a piece of chainmail the size of her palm. She held it up to the light. The steel rings shimmered. They moved. They flowed like fish scales. Sora said quietly, "It's beautiful." Daniel said it wasn't for beauty. It was so an arrow wouldn't pierce the chest, so a knife wouldn't enter the stomach, so his men would return home alive. Sora looked at him. Then she said, "That's beautiful too." The chainmail grew, month by month, link by link. Daniel and Sora worked together every evening, in silence, side by side. Their fingers sometimes touched as they passed the wire. No one said a word. But the whole village saw, and remained silent, because the teacher and his first student sat side by side every evening and made together something no one had ever seen before. And between them was something that didn't need to be named to be understood. By the end of the 6th year, Daniel had finished his first chainmail. He put it on the wooden mannequin that Jinu had carved. He took a spear with a bronze tip. He struck. The tip slid over the rings. It didn't pierce. He struck harder. The rings dented but held. He struck with an iron spear. The chainmail held. A dent, but not a single ring came apart. Chulsu stood nearby and watched. He said, "I need one like that." Daniel said, "Everyone needs one like that. But one chainmail takes half a year of work. We need more people, more hands, more wire. We need a way to pull the wire faster. We need a machine. We need a water wheel. We need the river's power instead of the power of our hands." He drew a diagram of a water wheel on birch bark. Jinu watched. Sora watched. Hunters came over and looked. One of them asked what the drawing was. Daniel said it was a wheel turned by the river, and the wheel pulls the wire. And the wire becomes chainmail. The hunter didn't understand. He decided it was a map of spirits. He asked permission to hang the drawing in his dugout for good luck on the hunt. Daniel agreed. He laughed to himself later by the forge, but his hands didn't stop. He forged, every day, knives, tips, blades, iron, steel, forged, hardened, tempered, each one for a specific person. For Chulsu, a heavy, wide blade to match his swing. For Jin, a long, straight sword for formation combat. For Teho, a short, light one for quick strikes. He remembered every hand, every grip, every shoulder. Not just any weapon, a weapon for that specific person, always. In the 7th year, Emma arrived. Daniel was standing by the forge, shaping a steel blade, when a sentry on the wall shouted that a man was coming from the east, alone, unarmed. Daniel climbed up onto the wall. A figure was walking along the path from the river, slowly, hesitantly, like a man who had been walking for a very long time and could barely go any further. When the figure came closer, Daniel saw and couldn't believe his eyes. Light hair, long, dirty, tangled, pale skin, sunburned on the cheekbones, blue eyes, strange clothing. Not animal skins, something woven, coarse but woven with a pattern. No tribe in the area knew how to weave. The woman stopped at the gate, raised her hands, palms up. This gesture was universal. "I am unarmed." Daniel came down and went out to her. She spoke. Her language was broken, a mixture of the local dialect and else, something Daniel didn't recognize at first, and when he did, his legs went weak. English. Mangled, ground down by generations of retelling, but English. She said her name was Emma, that she had come from the north, that she had been walking for 20 days, that she had heard of a man from the south who made ringing stones. Daniel stood and looked at her and couldn't say a word, because for the first time in 7 years, a person from his world stood before him. Not from his time, not from his life, but from his world. He led her to the hearth, gave her water, gave her food. She ate greedily. Her hands were shaking, thin, exhausted, leather bindings on her feet worn through to holes. When she had eaten, Daniel spoke in English. The words came out with difficulty. He hadn't spoken a single word of English in 7 years. His tongue stumbled over the first few sentences. But then he remembered, and the words poured out. "Who are you? Where are you from? How did you get here?" Emma talked for 3 hours. Her great-grandfather Eric was a Norwegian biologist. He appeared in this world about 200 years ago, just like Daniel, out of nowhere, into the snow. A northern tribe took him in. He lived among them for 40 years. He taught them what he knew, farming. He started sheep farming with the local mountain goats, weaving with wool, a simple writing system, sourdough bread. But he wasn't an engineer. He didn't know metallurgy. He didn't know how to extract copper from stone. He died without passing on the most important thing. Emma was his great-granddaughter, the 4th generation. She grew up with stories of her great-grandfather passed down by word of mouth, with fragments of English that became more and more mixed with the local language with each generation. with notes on birch bark that she could barely decipher because her great-grandfather wrote in Norwegian, while she had learned English words from her mother, who had learned them from her grandmother, who had learned them from Eric himself. A chain of 4 links, each weaker than the last. Emma came because she heard rumors. In the north, they said that somewhere in the south lived a man who turned stones into knives, who built walls out of earth, who said no to the gods and survived. She walked for 20 days through the forest and the tundra, alone, because no one in her tribe believed the rumors were true, and because she had nothing to lose. Her tribe had been destroyed by the High Ones 2 years ago for failing to pay tribute, the Black Circle. She survived because she was in the forest when it happened. She arrived in the morning and found scorched earth and a smell she couldn't describe. For 2 years, she lived alone, or with other tribes that took her in for a time and then drove her on. When she finished speaking, Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He cried. Not out of grief, because someone had finally understood him, completely, to the very end. He spoke to her in English, and she understood. Not everything, not every word, but the gist. She knew what it meant to be an outsider in a world where you know more than everyone around you. She'd known it since birth. Sora stood to the side and watched. She didn't understand the language they were speaking, but she saw the tears on Daniel's face, for the first time in 7 years. And something in her gaze changed. Not jealousy, something more complex. The realization that there was a part of the teacher's life she could never share. Emma had stayed. She had brought with her knowledge that Daniel lacked. Sheep farming. Mountain goats that the northern tribes had begun to domesticate using her great-grandfather's method. Wool. Spinning. Weaving on the simplest loom. Sourdough starter for bread made from wild grain. Daniel looked at it and saw the missing pieces of the mosaic he had been building for 7 years. Metallurgy without weaving is an army without clothing, weapons without equipment, swords without banners. Emma gave him the other half of civilization. She brought something else as well. Information. Her great-grandfather had seen the Tall Ones up close, once, before he died. He had written it down on birch bark in Norwegian. Emma had translated it for Daniel as best she could. Eric wrote that the Tall Ones were not immortal, that they aged. Slower than humans, but they aged. That their skin is pale because they have lived for generations in mountain caves. That their metal objects are old, very old, worn, with signs of repair. They don't make new ones, they repair the old ones. Which means they've lost their technology. They are keepers, not creators. This confirmed what Daniel had suspected from the day he saw the bracelet on the messenger's wrist. The Tall Ones aren't gods, they are heirs. Heirs to something that came before them, something that collapsed. And they cling to the remnants of the old world like a drowning man clings to shipwreck. And so as not to drown completely, they're drowning everyone else, keeping the world in the Stone Age. Because if the world rises up, the High Ones will have nothing left to scare it with. Daniel stood on the wall at night and looked at the mountains. Now he knew what was there. Not a temple of the gods. Not a palace of the immortals. A cave with the wreckage of the past world. A museum of a dead civilization. And a handful of creatures sitting among the exhibits, pretending they were the masters. He needed to go there. Not now, but soon. Sora stood beside him, silent, as always. He turned to her, said that everything would change soon. She said that everything had already changed, and she was right. The war came in the fall of the 7th year. Daniel had been waiting for it for 5 years. He'd been preparing, counting the days, and yet it came too soon. A scout ran in from the western outpost at dawn, gasping for breath, his face pale. He said one word. They're coming. Daniel climbed the wall. Morning fog lay over the plain. Figures emerged from the fog, tall ones, 6 of them. Not a single messenger like last time. 6. And with them were people. 30 or 40 warriors from the mountain tribes. Slaves or allies, Daniel didn't know. but their spears were made of stone, and the tall ones held something else in their hands. Long poles made of that same silvery metal, light, thin, deadly. Daniel saw one of the tall ones lazily twirl the pole in his hand. The movement was quick, too quick for a creature 2.5 meters tall. He climbed down from the wall. There was little time, maybe an hour, maybe less. He gave the orders he had been preparing in his head for 5 years. Chulsu lined up the hunters behind the stockade, 40 men, 12 women, all with spears, bronze and iron tips. There were few steel ones. 12 swords, all steel. Daniel handed them out to the best, Chulsu, Jin, Teho, the 9 most experienced fighters. The archers took their places on the wall. 8 bows, with copper and bronze arrows. There weren't enough steel arrowheads, only 30. 30 arrows with steel arrowheads, against 6 of the tall ones. Daniel put on the chainmail, the only one. He had forged it for himself, but changed his mind at the last moment. He called Sora over. He put the chainmail on her. She started saying she couldn't, that it was his. He said briefly, "I need you alive, more than I need myself." She fell silent. She put it on. The chainmail was too big for her. It hung below her knees, but it covered her chest and stomach, and that was the main thing. Daniel took a copper sword, not a steel one. All the steel ones had been handed out. He stood behind the line of spearmen. Hwasun was beside him. The old woman couldn't fight, but she stood there, with a knife in her hand, with her back straight. 72 years of life behind that back. The tall ones approached the palisade. They stopped 50 paces away. One of them stepped forward, a woman, tall, pale, with silver eyes, dressed in white. So beautiful it hurt to look at her. Aylin. Daniel realized this before she spoke. The leader, the priestess, the one who sent the messengers, the one who decided which tribe would live and which would become a black circle. Aylin looked at the palisade, at the wall, at the people behind her, at the bows, at the glint of metal. She spoke. Her voice was like music, clear, effortless. She spoke the language of the people, correctly, without an accent. She said she had not come to fight, that she had come to take what belonged to the high ones, the children and the girls, and she added something new, the head of the one who taught the ants to bite. Daniel stood behind the wall and heard every word. His heart was pounding. His hands were sweaty on the hilt of his sword, but his voice didn't tremble when he replied. He shouted from the wall. "There's nothing to take. There are no slaves here. There is no tribute here. There are free people here, and they want for you to leave." Aylin smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just been shown a coin trick. Amusing, but not serious. She raised her hand. 5 of the tall ones and 30 mountain warriors moved forward. Daniel shouted, "Bows!" 8 arrows flew from the wall. 3 hit their mark. 1 hit a mountain warrior. He fell. 2 hit a tall one. 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the thigh. He flinched, slowed down, but didn't fall. He kept walking. A second arrow. A third. The mountain warriors ran toward the palisade. They slammed into the wall. They began to climb. The spearmen met them. A scream, a clang, a crunch. People were killing people. Daniel didn't look. He was watching the tall ones. They were walking slowly. They weren't running. Arrows stuck out of 2 of them. 1 was limping, but they kept walking. And when the first of them reached the palisade, he struck it with a pole. The logs flew apart like splinters with a single blow, a hole in the wall 2 men tall. The tall one stepped through the hole. The spearmen struck. 6 spears to the chest. The tall one grabbed 2 spears with his hands, broke them, threw the men aside like puppets. A third spear pierced his side, a bronze tip. It didn't go in deep. The tall one yanked the spear from his body and struck the nearest man with it. The man fell and didn't get up. Daniel shouted commands. Steel swords forward. Chulsu and Jinhun rushed at the tall one from both sides. Chulsu struck his leg with a sword. The steel sank into the flesh, deeply. The tall one screamed, the first scream of a god in this world. Jinhun struck from the other side, in the arm. The tall one fell to one knee. Taeho drove his spear into the tall one's throat from above. The tall one collapsed. The first god slain in the history of this world. But there were 6 of them. 5 more. 5 more holes in the palisade. 5 more creatures striking with their clubs, breaking people like twigs. The battle lasted an hour. An hour Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. He didn't fight. He stood in the center and shouted. He directed. He shuffled people from one breach to another. He made sure the archers shot at the tall ones and not at the mountain warriors. That the steel swords went where the tall one was already wounded. That the spearmen would hold off the mountain warriors and not charge the tall ones without steel in their hands. He was no warrior. He was an engineer. And he managed the battle as one manages a process in a factory. Flow, pressure, bottlenecks, resource allocation. When the second tall one fell, the men shouted, not in horror, in fury. They screamed and rushed at the third, at the fourth. Steel swords clanged, blood flowed, red, human, on both sides. The 4th tall one was wounded. He retreated. The 5th was wounded. He retreated. The 6th, Aylin, stood aside and watched. She did not join the fight, not once. She stood and watched as her warriors were killed. Then she turned and walked away. The mountain warriors ran after her. The battlefield fell silent. Daniel stood in the middle of the ruined palisade. Bodies lay all around. Many bodies. He counted. 17 mountain warriors, 2 dead high ones, 4 wounded had left. His men. He started counting and couldn't finish the first time because his hands were shaking. He started again. 130. 130 people. Dead. Out of 250, more than half. Among them was Taeho, the boy archer, 16 years old. A tall one broke his neck with a single blow of a pole. Among them was old Kimo, who baked bread using Emma's recipe and treated the children every morning. Among them was Bowman, who hauled ore and was always singing. Among them were dozens of people Daniel knew by name, for whom he forged knives, for whom he made things. Daniel stood and looked out at the field. Then he fell to his knees and screamed. Not a word, a sound, a howl. The cry of a man who had spent 10 years building a stairway to heaven and had just paid a price for it that he could not bear. Sora approached. Her chainmail was covered in blood. Not hers, someone else's. She knelt down beside him. She embraced him. He screamed into her shoulder. She held him. Silently, tightly. The way you hold a child having a terrible nightmare. Only the dream didn't end. A month had passed since the battle. The settlement stood in silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of a place from which half the voices had been torn away. 120 people remained. 30 of them were wounded. The palisade had been destroyed in 5 places. 2 furnaces were damaged. Supplies were scattered and partially destroyed. Daniel didn't speak for 3 days after the battle. He sat by the extinguished furnace and stared into space. Sora brought him food. He didn't eat. Jinu came and stood beside him, silently, with his arm bandaged. The tall one had broken 2 fingers on his left hand, the fingers he used to feel the heat of the firewood. Hwasun came on the 4th day. She sat across from him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she hit him on the knee with a stick. It hurt. Daniel raised his head. Hwasun said that the dead had gone, that the living were waiting, that the furnace was cold and no one but him knew how to repair the broken bellows, that winter was coming, that the wounded needed medicine and warm food, that the children were crying, that Sora hadn't slept for 5 nights, that if he'd decided to die beside the dead furnace, he should say so aloud so she could start looking for a replacement for him. Daniel looked at her, at the old, wrinkled face, at the eyes that had seen more deaths in 72 years than he had seen in his entire life in both worlds, at the hands that trembled with age but held the stick firmly. He stood up, went to the horn, lit a fire. He began to work. From that day on, he didn't stop. He worked like a man possessed. He repaired the bellows, he repaired the forge, he rebuilt the palisade. He wasn't alone. Everyone worked. Chulsu gave the orders. Zin forged with one hand. His left hand was in a splint, but with his right he swung the hammer precisely and with force. Emma organized the women. They wove, they sewed, they bandaged the wounded. They prepared food for everyone from what was left. Sora worked at the potter's wheel for 12 hours at a time. Molds for arrowheads, crucibles, storage pots, storage. Everything that had been broken in battle had to be remade. 2 weeks later, people arrived at the settlement. 30 people from the Swift Otter tribe. They had heard about the battle. They had seen the wounded tall ones walking back into the mountains, wounded gods, bleeding to death, limping. That changed everything. The gods are mortal. The gods are vulnerable. The gods are fleeing. Swift Otter did not come out of pity, out of calculation. They wanted to be on the side of those who wound the gods, not those whom the gods burn. A month later, another 40 arrived from 2 small tribes in the east, then 20 from the south. Daniel welcomed them all. He gave them weapons. He gave them work. He gave them a place to stay. By the end of the winter of the 7th year, there were 250 people in the settlement again, and by the spring of the 8th year, 300. Daniel realized he needed a structure. You can't manage 300 people like a tribe of 50. He created a council. 5 people. Himself. Chulsu as head of the hunters and warriors. Hwasun as keeper of traditions and mediator between the old and the new. Jinu as head of blacksmithing. Emma as head of weaving and agriculture and keeper of the second line of knowledge. Every decision was made by the council, not by Daniel alone. He insisted on this, because if he died tomorrow, the council would continue. And if everything depended on a single person, then a single arrow would send the world back to the Stone Age. Minsu appeared in the middle of the 8th year. Scouts found her in the forest, 3 days' journey to the west, on the ruins of a burned-down camp. A black circle, scorched earth, a smell Emma knew all too well. The girl was sitting on the edge of the circle. She was 14, small, dirty, wild as a little animal. She didn't speak. The scouts brought her to the settlement. Hwasun took her in, fed her, gave her water, covered her with a fur for the night. Minsu didn't speak for a month. She looked at everyone with huge eyes. She flinched at loud noises. She wouldn't let men come closer than 5 steps. Sora began working with her, quietly, slowly. She showed her how to knead clay, how to mold it. Minsu's hands trembled the first few days. Then they stopped. The clay calmed her. The work calmed her. A month later, Minsu molded her first pot. Crooked, small, but whole. She lifted it and looked at Sora. Sora smiled and said, "Good job." The same words Daniel had said to her 7 years ago. Minsu opened her mouth and spoke. Her first word in a month. She said, "More." Hwasun, who was standing nearby, covered her face with her hands. Then something unusual came to light. Minsu remembered everything. Every word she had heard. Every recipe Daniel had dictated by the furnace. Every number. Every proportion. Daniel tested her. He dictated the bronze recipe to her once. 3 days later, he asked her to repeat it. She repeated it word for word. He dictated the recipe for steel. She memorized it on the first try. Temperatures, proportions, holding time, everything. Daniel looked at her and saw what he had been searching for 7 years. A living book. A repository of knowledge that wouldn't burn in a fire or shatter like a clay tablet. He gave her birch bark and a piece of charcoal. He said that if she couldn't speak, then she should write. He showed her the pictograms. Minsu stared at the symbols for half an hour. Then she began to write. She wrote all night. By morning, she held a stack of birch bark sheets in her hands. On them was written every recipe she had heard by the furnace over the past month, every conversation between Daniel and Xenu about temperature and alloys, every word. Daniel leafed through the birch bark, his hands trembling. It was the first book, the first real book in the history of this world, written by a 14-year-old girl who couldn't speak for a month because she had seen her parents burned alive. He said to her quietly, "Your voice is now eternal." Minsu looked at him and smiled for the first time. After the battle, Daniel went through a crisis, but returned to work. The population grew to 300 people thanks to the tribes that learned of the High One's wounding. A council of 5 was formed. Minsu, an orphan with a perfect memory, was found. She became the first archivist and created the world's first book. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.